Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Here with me, I have a very special speaker, one of the most important people when it comes to ELF research. And we couldn't be happier to have him here with us. So, Martin, thank you very much for your generosity, for donating your time to the LT community. And he needs no introduction, but I'm going to quickly read his bio. Martin Dewey is senior lecturer at King's College London, where he is a program director for an MA in Applied Linguistics and ELT. His research focuses on the globalization of English, exploring the nature and status of English as a lingua franca, ELF, particularly in relation to investigating the relevance of ELF for language teacher education. He has presented and published widely on this work. He is co-author with Alessia Kogo of Analyzing English as Lingua Franca, a corpus-based analysis, continuum 2012, and editor with Jennifer Jenkins, who was also speaker for our ELF Week last year, and Will Baker of the Handbook of English as a Lingua Franca, Routledge 2018. So Dewey, over to you.
Thank you very much. And so I'll start by saying hello and thank you for that introduction, very generous, kind introduction. It gives me great pleasure to be able to talk to people. I'm in Cambridge at the moment in the UK, but sort of speaking from King's College London as well. My telephone's going off. There we go. Put that on silent. So, yes, it gives me great pleasure to talk to you about my research and my interest in English as a lingua franca, which really date back to quite early on in the field, to when I was working, first of all, on my MA as a student with Jennifer Jenkins, and then later on my PhD. So I studied under Jennifer Jenkins both for my master's degree and then for my PhD, when English as a lingua franca was really becoming established as a field. So I've been around English as a lingua franca for some time. Okay, and what I'm going to talk about now today in this webinar is my research focus on trying to understand how teachers can respond to developments in English as a lingua franca, how teachers can respond to the globalization of English and English language communication in their classroom practices, primarily based on research that I've conducted with teachers. Okay, so I will share my slides. Where are we? There we go. So hopefully now you can see my slides. Is that right? You can see the slides now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I will talk to you first of all about my, there we go. What it's not letting me do now is, there we go, okay. Right, so my research objectives have always been to understand how the globalization of English has implications for language teaching and language learning. So I'm interested in the linguistic developments initially of the globalization of English, in relation to how we might need to reformulate ideas about language pedagogy in response to the globalization, the global spread of English. My main objective has been, in recent years, to move beyond discussing what implications ELF has for language teaching. There's been quite a lot of discussion of that in the literature over the years, but really trying to move beyond implication to understand what it means in practice in terms of how we might apply research findings from English as a lingua franca in sort of practical, classroom relevant ways. The central to this, to my mind, is teacher education. Teacher education provides a way of exposing language teachers, novice teachers and trainee teachers to the changing nature of English. And it's a means of promoting critical reflection on very established norms and practices in English language teaching. And this has really been the focus of my work over the past few years. Right, so teacher education really is the key to understanding how we respond to English as a lingua franca. I'm going to talk to you about some of my research data. The research participants I have been working with over the past couple of years are both pre-service and in-service language teachers. So I'm looking at novice and expert practitioners and how they understand English as a lingua franca, how they make sense of English as a lingua franca. The analysis, the data analysis that I've conducted has been doing an online survey. I've conducted some semi-structured interviews and focus groups with, as I say, both pre-service and in-service teachers. My principal research question has been, as English changes, how do practitioners' attitudes towards language and language teaching change, or at least need to change, in order to develop further in relation to English as a lingua franca? My interest here has been in trying to promote a much better awareness and understanding of sociolinguistics in English language teaching. I think for many years we've had relatively little focus on sociolinguistics in ELT language teacher education. So that's partly been a lot of my work is focused on that, promoting better understanding and awareness of global linguistic diversity and the relevance of global Englishes and ELF for language teaching. Okay, before reporting on my research findings, I'll give a little bit more background to the study of English in the context of globalization and how I go about trying to promote awareness of the sociolinguistics of English among language teachers. So this is one of the topics that I focus on with my students on our master's program at King's. I talk about the status of English globally, and I think that's very important for language teachers to understand. Now, it's a useful starting point, I think, for really developing much better awareness of sociolinguistics. It's important for teachers to recognise and learners to recognise the status of the language globally, as this is having very substantial impact in all manner of educational contexts worldwide. As a result of the global status of the language, English is being given a much more prominent position in the curriculum. It's a compulsory subject in primary schools, it's being taught at a younger age, and it's being given more time in the curriculum, in the timetable. In many settings, this has meant teachers are being put under quite a lot of pressure to adopt methods that may feel quite unfamiliar to them. They may be asked to use English as the main or even only medium of instruction, for example, and we get quite extensive promotion of clear content and language integrated learning, with the effect that many non-language specialist teachers are being asked to use English in the classroom, often without additional training or support. In many, many contexts, there is obviously substantial importance attached to English language proficiency as an entry requirement for both in higher education and in employment. So I think that changing situation requires quite radical, I think, rethinking of how we approach language teaching, which hasn't always been the case. I don't think that, so the changes that we see in relation to the status of English have not necessarily brought about changes in terms of the way we think about English in the curriculum. And this is I think, where there could be cause for problems. As a university based in London, in the UK, I'm at a very privileged, a very privileged position in terms of raising awareness of linguistic diversity. So it's very easy for me to use as a case study with my students London itself. So, for example, it's an exceptional case study of linguistic diversity. There are more than 300 what we call community languages spoken in London schools. For example, in a study carried out relatively recently, it was found that approximately 1.7 million people in London do not speak English as their first language. And 40% of London's school children do not speak English at home. There is also exceptional diversity in London in terms of the languages being spoken. Polish, French, Spanish, Arabic, Bengali, Gujarati, Punjabi, Cantonese, Mandarin, Hokkien. These are some of the top languages in terms of number of speakers currently in London. What's interesting here from an English language teaching perspective, of course, is there are thousands of students who come to London to learn English. They come here because it's an English speaking environment. What they don't always realize is how linguistically diverse the city is. Okay. So as I say, it's a very useful context for raising awareness of global linguistic diversity among our students. And I think this is a really useful starting point for generating discussion of the relevance of ELF for language teachers. I also talk about some of the changes that have taken place in terms of policy. So, for example, I use this position statement on English as a global language that was issued by TESOL a number of years ago now. I'll highlight on the next slide the most relevant section of this. So, in short, what the statement says is that English can no longer be considered a foreign language as such, since its global presence makes this description untenable. Yeah? What does it mean to say that English is a foreign language? It's always, in English language teaching, being described as English is a foreign language. That was the traditional description. But where is English foreign, and to whom is it foreign exactly, given the globalization of the language? In terms of practice in language teaching, it suggests that we can no longer viably adopt a single model of the language, say standard British English or standard American English. But this is, of course, precisely what we have continued to do. We continue to promote standard British English and standard American English. We are continuing to work with fairly monolithic versions of the language and modeling English in a fairly static rather than dynamic way. And of course, my research, my work, and the work of many others in English as a lingua franca has revealed how dynamic the use of English is in lingua franca settings. So we're at odds here in terms of how we conceptualize English in the profession, in the ELT profession, and how English is enacted when it's used in conversation as a contact language or as a lingua franca. Excuse me. So if we moving on to English as a lingua franca, I'll talk a little bit more specifically about researching English as a lingua franca. I won't say very much because obviously people are already aware of ELF. I do spend quite a lot of time with students on our master's programs talking about ELF research and providing background into ELF research, but I'm not going to look at any ELF data as such, but I'm simply going to remind people that there are a number of, well, now 3 very large scale, each a 1 million word database of ELF interactions, 3 large scale corpora available, hosted respectively at the University of Vienna, at Helsinki and Hong Kong. The most freely accessible of these is the voice corpus, but I would encourage people interested to look at ELF data to access each of those websites and have a look at English as a lingua franca in action. So I'm not going to show any English as a lingua franca data as such in the interest of time, and I think probably anyone involved in these webinars so far has probably already looked at a lot of that data. What I want to do briefly is just summarize what the research in ELF has shown us so far. What it's revealed is, well, language is naturally fluid and dynamic. We know that already. All language use is fluid and dynamic, but this seems to be particularly enhanced in ELF settings, which of course will have major implications for language teaching. What we also know is that speakers in English as a lingua franca settings will use non-standard forms in regular, systematic and principled ways. They use non-standard forms primarily in communicatively motivated ways. In other words, adapting the forms that they speak is done so very strategically in order to achieve communication. So emergent forms occur not as the result of a lack in proficiency, which would be the traditional version of explaining these non-standard forms, but through processes of collaborative construction of meaning. Okay. ELF interaction particularly involves drawing on, manipulating, and combining linguistic resources from within multilingual repertoires. And in recent years, there's been quite a lot of focus on multilingualism, particularly with the work of Jennifer Jenkins, again, looking at English as a multilingual franca. Okay, good. So moving on. What does summarize the key research findings of lingua franca communication? Really, what's really interesting is what it means for our understanding of native speaker English and native English speakers. So native speaker English norms clearly are not optimal for interaction in multilingual settings. This has been a clear finding in quite a lot of studies. Native English speakers, we know, are predominantly monolingual, and so therefore are not ideal models for effective multilingual communication. But this is exactly what we have continued to do. We've continued to promote a monolingual version of English when we teach the language. Intelligibility is more likely to become a problem with the presence of native English speakers. There have been a number of studies that have revealed how intelligibility issues become more apparent when you have native speakers taking part in a lingua franca interaction than when you don't have them taking part in a lingua franca interaction. English is most effective in lingua franca settings when speakers are willing to modify their language patterns. We've talked at some length in English as a lingua franca of the importance of accommodation, for example, and being able to adapt in that respect. Non-native English speaker proficiency, therefore, needs to be characterized not by conformity to a set of fixed and established norms, but rather characterized by accommodation strategies and the ability to draw on accommodation strategies. In other words, to engage in a much more listener-oriented speech in order to produce intercultural awareness and understanding. Okay. So what I've been really interested in doing is researching how much awareness teachers have of English as a lingua franca, first of all, and how much understanding they have of what those implications might mean for the language classroom. So I'll talk briefly, first of all, about some questionnaire data that I have gathered in recent years. Here is a slide that shows responses to a questionnaire item, which asked participants, all of whom were practicing teachers of English, to express their level of familiarity with some key terms that they would come across in global English, in the field of global Englishes. Respondents were asked to record a score from 0, equating with not at all familiar, to 5, meaning very familiar, and each score represented by increasingly darker shades of green in this table. In other words, items with predominantly light green were those items that participants were least familiar with, while those in dark green were the ones that participants were more familiar with. In other words, participants were most familiar with the terms English as a lingua franca and standard English. So this suggests that there is, amongst these teachers, a very broad awareness of English as a lingua franca. In addition to excuse me, okay. So what was interesting was there was relatively little understanding of world Englishes, so that the nativized varieties, Singlish and so on, but much more understanding of, or at least awareness of, global Englishes as a field and English as a lingua franca than there had been in the past. And so I've noticed that among practicing teachers, there is a growing awareness of English as a lingua franca, which is very good news, of course. Okay. Now, in addition to exploring teachers' awareness of ELF and global Englishes, I also wanted to see whether or not this awareness was reflected in teachers' approaches to language in the classroom. So to this end, I then asked teachers to report to what extent they agreed or disagreed with a series of statements designed to reflect either a relatively conservative approach to English, which could be characterized by strong adherence to standard native speaker norms of correctness, or what might be described as a relatively more progressive approach, which I see as being characterized by a willingness to allow students to experiment with language forms, and understanding that promoting communicative strategies are more important than using correct grammar and so on. And responses to this item were more mixed than with other items. So, which suggests that while there is quite widespread awareness of ELF, this is not always leading to any change in perception when it comes to teaching approach or teaching priorities. But nevertheless, overall, the more progressively oriented statements generally received stronger agreement than the more conservative ones, as can be seen with the relatively high level of dark green, which signals agreement, for the following three statements. The students, so the three statements receiving the highest agreement were the students' L1 and socio-cultural identity are resources that can enrich English. Teachers should encourage students to experiment with new language forms to communicate meaning. And developing communicative strategies is more important than learning to use correct grammar. So all of those statements would be very compatible with an ELF perspective on language in the classroom. So that's very encouraging. Okay. I also asked, following on from previous questionnaire items where participants were asked about their awareness of different varieties of English or different versions of English, I also asked participants to give their own definition of three of those terms. English as a lingua franca, standard English, and good English, right, which I put in inverted commas. So here are some of the typical answers that teachers provided for their definition of good English. And as you can see, for many of the teachers, what counted as good English was very closely related to notions of correctness. And these very often specifically were expressed in terms of native speaker grammar, but also in relation to pronunciation, and in some cases to English specifically as spoken in the UK. Those several teachers referred to English in relation to the notion of proper. So some of those statements talked about proper English. So this is very interesting because it seems to contradict the finding that teachers are very aware of ELF and then at least partly positively predisposed to an ELF orientation to language in the classroom, or at least an ELF perspective on language in the classroom. And if we contrast those statements with the following, there were a number of teachers in the study who described good English very differently, expressing a much more nuanced and arguably a more progressive position on the concept, identifying this in relation to communication and intelligibility, with several participants stating that this was not connected with standard language and that it was context dependent. In other words, these are notions that would be much more compatible with a lingua franca perspective than with a traditional standard language perspective. Okay. Right, so here you see participants talking about how good English refers to being able to communicate successfully, being able to maintain intelligibility, and several of them talking about it not relating to standard English, being quite specific about that. Okay, I'll talk a little bit now about some of the interview data that I've collected recently, particularly in relation to how teachers position themselves as English speakers and English teachers, and also how they identify with English and in English. Okay, so the principal research question that I was interested in asking in the interviews I conducted with teachers was to determine whether and in what ways teachers felt that their views on English and on their approach to teaching English have changed as a result of studying on the MA program that I teach at King's. So, as I said before, they're all practicing teachers who study a course in sociolinguistics. So the interview data was really focused on that, on asking people how or in what ways have your views changed as a result of studying sociolinguistics and as a result of becoming aware of ELF as a subject. Specifically, I was interested in whether or not teachers felt that having an awareness of global Englishes and ELF would have any impact on their thinking and their practice as teachers. Now, the first case study I'll refer to, the participant that I've named Nahid, and this case study is an experienced language teacher who is a Marathi speaker. Marathi is one of 23 official languages in India. It is the official language of Maharashtra state in Western India, which you can see indicated on the map. At the time the interviews were conducted, Nahid had been teaching English in London for 8 years. She also speaks Gujarati, Hindi, and some German. Her schooling was all in English, which she now identifies as her most proficient language. Before looking at her interview responses, I would like to first highlight what she wrote in response to the questionnaire item, in which I asked teachers to state what they understood by the terms English as a lingua franca, standard English, and good English. So here we're looking at her individual responses to this item. Okay, and as you can see, Nahid was one of the teachers who related good English not to notions of correctness or grammaticality, but connected the idea with intelligibility and pragmatics. Okay? Despite not being standard, it's intelligible. It might have more pragmatic and elliptic forms. I will turn to the subsequent questionnaire item now, in which I asked about teachers' language teaching priorities. So the following question in the questionnaire was, thinking about your own teaching context, please state whether you agree or disagree with the following statements. So these are the statements that we looked at before when I showed you some of the questionnaire findings. So here you can see Nahid's responses to some of those statements. And these are statements that represent a more traditional approach to language in the classroom, where native speaker English is seen as the most desirable model, where correctness is prioritized, and where learners are seen to prefer native English speaking teachers rather than non-native English speaking teachers. In this study, I sort of defined these statements as ELF unfriendly, in that they are not compatible with a lingua franca perspective on language and communication. And as you can see here, each of these Nahid either strongly disagreed or disagreed with. Okay, so for the first 3 items, you've got strongly disagree, score of 0, and then for the final one, disagree, score of 2. Okay. Now, by contrast, Nahid strongly agreed with each of the statements that can be understood to reflect a less conventional approach to language, which I describe here as an ELF favourable classroom perspective. So in short, from Nahid's questionnaire responses, we can see that she has a good awareness, first of all, a good awareness of global Englishes and ELF, and also that this awareness seems to have had some impact, at least, on her thinking in relation to classroom practice, as reflected in her responses to those statements in the questionnaire. When we look at Nahid's interview, by contrast, however, we can see that the way she identifies with her own English, her beliefs about her own practice in the classroom have a complex relationship. In this first extract, Nahid elaborates on her languages, stating again that English is her most proficient language, especially in academic settings. And yet, despite her awareness of ELF and global Englishes, she does not describe herself as a native speaker of English. She's not willing to describe herself as a native speaker of English. So just to clarify here, from a World Englishes or Global Englishes perspective, Nahid would be described as a native speaker of Indian English. And this was a topic that we discussed at some length on the master's program that Nahid took part in. Okay. In this following extract, Nahid was asked how she thought her colleagues on her MA course would describe her as a speaker of English. She reports that following MA lectures in which global Englishes was the topic, some of her classmates had said that she is therefore a native speaker of English. And not only does this shock her, but she also then comments that she does not value her own accent as a teacher in the classroom, stating that she does not teach pronunciation and suggesting that in practice, she does not see her accent as a valid model of English. So this suggests, disappointingly, unfortunately, that despite expressing very favourable views regarding an ELF perspective on language in the classroom, her beliefs in relation to her own classroom practices are still influenced by a very strong affiliation to notions of correctness and standard English. So we see here a very distinct and different characterization of her English as a viable model of language in the classroom, and what she says in the questionnaire responses about diversity in English. So it's findings such as this are quite commonplace in the data that I've collected. And I often see many teachers expressing, first of all, both awareness and understanding of ELF and global Englishes in principle, but then when referring to their approach to language in the classroom, still expressing ideas of language that suggest a strong influence from standard language ideology and the impact that this has on language learning and teaching practices, which hugely complicates the question of trying to develop a more practice-oriented response to English as a lingua franca research, or it complicates the move from implication to application. So I'd like to now talk about the relationship between academic work in ELF and current practice in ELT. So trying to connect research and theory in ELF with current practices in language teaching, and trying to move beyond this really complex set of beliefs that teachers have about, in the first place, about standard languages and their role in language learning and teaching practices, and then their growing awareness and understanding of ELF research and theory. So just to recap, I will again summarize the findings of ELF research and what they tell us about the properties of intercultural communication. So in short, there are several key strategies that speakers regularly employ in multilingual situations in which English functions as a lingua franca. And these are, as has been visited and revisited several times, code switching, or perhaps better, code sharing, the use of accommodation strategies, in other words, where speakers converge on each other's language forms in very cooperative, listener-oriented ways, paraphrasing, either as a move to preempt a perceived potential for communicative breakdown or to repair a moment of misunderstanding or non-understanding, We see a lot of hedging, where speakers display caution in what they say, or where they indicate levels of uncertainty in what they say. And this appears to be used convivially as a collaborative device to avoid potential for conflict or misunderstanding. There's a lot of utterance completion, and this is another way in which speakers collaboratively interact, pooling their language resources together to co-construct discourse. So long pauses between turns, for example, is relatively uncommon. There's a lot of latching and overlap with interlocutors quickly stepping in to provide a word or phrase if a linguistic gap is perceived. Back channels seem to be especially commonplace. Speakers are prepared to make and give explicit clarification requests. There's a lot of meta talk. In other words, there are frequent moments in ELF data where speakers overtly orient to how something is being said, commenting on word choice or phrasing. And again, this is broadly done in a very collaborative way. So I think, in short, what we really need to focus on is understanding how research in ELF raises a number of questions about current practices and requires us to rethink some rather long-standing beliefs we have held about language learning and teaching. In terms of rethinking our practices, the following are important. The most important aspect of this to me involves promoting better awareness of linguistic diversity globally, and especially in terms of the huge variety found in the ways English is used. So, as I've already said, this is a focus of a lot of the work that I do with our teachers on the MA programs that we teach at King's. I think we need to do more than simply present students with a single version of English or a limited number of versions of English. We need to rethink how much importance we attach to the models of English that we present when working with students. This entails introducing a critical perspective on language and language teaching. And in particular, in teacher education, I think it is essential that we uncover the language ideologies that underpin established practices in ELT. One way of doing this is to engage in discussion about popular language myths. And in addition, I feel we would do well to adopt, or in many cases return to, a less monolingual and a more multilingual perspective on our approach to teaching. Okay, so now in the slides that follow, I'll take a quick look at resources I have used to critically evaluate a monolingual perspective on language in education, which I think is really quite pervasive still. As you can see in the responses of Nahid in the interview, where she talks about her own language and her own accent as not being a viable model, despite a growing awareness and an understanding of English as a lingua franca and linguistic diversity that comes about as a result of ELF. So research in ELF from global Englishes suggests very clearly to me that we need to adopt a different, more multilingual perspective on language and communication. However, managing change can be unsettling and disorienting for teachers, especially if there is a potential for conflict with existing beliefs. And you can, as I say, I continually come across this conflict with teachers when I talk to them about their understanding of ELF and their response to ELF in classroom practices. So even when there is change in reported beliefs, this may not then be realised in practice. In order for research findings to have an impact on practice, therefore teachers need, well, they need first of all institutional support. Planned changes need to take account of teachers' existing beliefs and ideas of their professional identity. And essentially, teachers need to be involved in classroom-based research themselves, and researchers need to support teachers in order to facilitate this. Now, I think what's important to realise is that adopting an ELF perspective on pedagogy does not mean abandoning previous pedagogic practice in favour of a radically new approach. The findings of ELF research are still pretty much in their infancy. It's still a relatively new field, and as has often been stated, we still need a lot further empirical investigation if English language teachers are to begin incorporating ELF findings in practical, workable and meaningful ways. So the purpose of my work here is to think about how we can enable teachers to situate the possibilities of an ELF perspective or an ELF-oriented pedagogy in their existing and continually developing frames of reference, and in doing so to further facilitate informed choices in the decision-making process. Now, teachers have a vital role to play in the further expansion of knowledge in this area, and they can do this by engaging in the kind of teacher-led research that would help close the gap between sort of largely academic applied linguistic debate and the far more immediate concerns of the language classroom. I think action research is a key way or a key means by which this can be achieved. And here I've got a suggestion for an action research task, which I've used with teachers. And it's designed to encourage teachers to record and reflect on the occurrence of non-standard forms in their classroom. So the idea is here that teachers take a systematic approach to noticing when non-standard forms occur, whether those forms have an effect on communication, and to note down their own responses to those forms. It's a way of getting teachers to start to collect data on their own classrooms and what they do in response to language forms that are non-standard as they occur in practice. Okay, I think a key question here is what decisions do teachers need to make in their own practices? So further to encouraging teachers to reconsider how they orient to learners' language in the classroom, it's important to think about some very important questions regarding the kinds of decisions that teachers can make. And of course, this is very context dependent. The freedom that teachers have to make their own decisions about what they teach and how they teach it can vary quite considerably from one context to another. So it's really important that we pay close attention to that. Ultimately, in my view, it's worth encouraging teachers to explore alternatives to a predominantly norm-based approach to language in the classroom. And that the following slide presents a framework for developing what I've termed in the past a post-normative perspective. In other words, a perspective where we don't attach ourselves so firmly to native speaker standard English forms. Okay. So this framework poses a series of questions that I feel are often there in the background in English language teaching, but which can be very beneficial for teachers to address openly and overtly. So the questions are designed to address what level of importance should be attached to language norms, which model of English, or perhaps better, models of English plural, is or are most appropriate, and then to consider what pragmatic strategies are also relevant for learners in relation to their communicative needs. So it's setting up a series of questions that teachers can pose to themselves in their practices in relation to how much attention we need to pay to form and what language forms are going to be important to focus on, and whether or not we allow modification of those forms in order to achieve success in communication. Finally, I'd like to report fairly briefly on a focus group discussion. So initially I said I had questionnaire data, interview data, and focus group data. This is a conversation, or it's an extract from a conversation that took place among a group of teachers. Again, these were all experienced language teachers who were currently teaching English in language schools in London. The purpose of the focus group was to ask teachers to reflect on their own approach to learners' language in the classroom. And leading up to this extract here, teacher 2 had commented on an episode in her own class during which a student had suggested the word curiousness as a noun for the adjective curious. And key to this in the extract I'm showing you here is the way in which the teacher sees value in the student's suggested word. So the conversation turns to the question of what the teacher did in the class in response to the student's suggestion. Okay, so I'll leave that up for a moment to make sure you've got time to look at it. Okay, and then on the following slide, you can see that there's some interesting discussion here between two of the teachers in the group about how non-standard use of language can be very effective. And with the teachers providing some acknowledgement here that students will often do this. And also there's a shared understanding that this raises very important questions about materials and recommended practices. So I think it's really, really useful to promote this kind of discussion among teachers where they talk about non-standard forms, or they talk about learner language with each other, which is why I think focus group data is very valuable in this respect, in terms of promoting greater understanding of the way we use English in lingua franca communication. I think that's really important in terms of long-term teacher development and sort of the development of professional expertise, which traditionally in the past was much more focused on methods, and which now I think needs to continue to be more focused on the language itself. So teacher development has in the past been about developing new ways of presenting, practicing language, but with relatively little discussion of teachers' understanding of the language itself and of how language is used itself. And this focus group conversation, I think, is a very interesting example of how teachers can be encouraged to engage in a discussion of the language and how it can be used by learners in effective but non-standard ways. So, in conclusion, excuse me. So, in conclusion, I would like to just talk about the most salient themes that have emerged in the data I've collected in the past couple of years. So it's clear that teachers are beginning to develop a greater awareness of ELF and global Englishes and the possible impact of this type of research on pedagogic beliefs and practices. And there is certainly much more debate about this topic in English language teaching now than there was 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, when I started researching teachers' understanding of the globalization of English. And teachers, what we've seen is that, or what I continually see when I talk to teachers about this, is that teachers' responses to ELF are very complex, especially when we take into account perceptions of professional identity. So one teacher in my study, for instance, talked about having her own language ego. She noted that while she was very open to the idea of accepting linguistic diversity in her classroom, and she was happy to acknowledge the role, for example, of code switching in multilingual settings, she also said of herself that she was a bit of a perfectionist and she doesn't like to mix her language. And she talked about being sort of priding herself on being able to reproduce standard language forms. So clearly, everything that I've talked about here, I think, has major implications for how we devise the curriculum in language teacher education. And in many contexts, I think we need to promote much more awareness of sociolinguistics, especially with regard to linguistic diversity. This is something that's, I think, going to take a lot of time. Okay, I think that's pretty much me done. Thank you very much for listening. I will return now to... Right, so what do I need to do now?
Now you need to stop sharing the screen.
I need to stop sharing. Right. Where's there it is.
Yes.
Stop sharing.
Right.
Okay.
There.
Right. So, okay. Hopefully that was interesting.
That was great.
Thought-provoking. It's a little bit rushed through, but what do we do? Is it now question and answer?
Yeah, we have some questions here for you.
Okay. Yeah.
First, Martin, thank you very much. It's really a lot of food for thought, and in terms of pedagogy, we're still, I think, we still have a long way to go, right? So I think some of these questions are going to be, they're very complex. So the first question from Natalia, and she works with aviation English in Brazil, which is an ELF environment,
Right.
one would
Right.
say.
Yeah.
She says, one of the criticisms we get a lot is that intelligibility is setting the bar too low and that our learners end up being judged based on adherence to a native speaker standard by their native speaker and non-native speaker interlocutors. How do you respond to the criticism that we are selling our students short, and what others see as settling for, like quote unquote, settling for intelligibility?
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, that's a common, I think, perception, that by focusing on intelligibility and not attaching importance to standard forms, then we are somehow selling students short. I think I think there are two aspects to this. One is, first of all, promoting a better understanding of what's involved in interaction and what's involved in intelligibility. So I think it's really important that teachers and students are made aware of how intelligibility is something that's co-constructed. So there's nothing inherently intelligible about a language form. So it only becomes intelligible when it is used in a particular context for a particular purpose. So I think intelligibility is we're not settling for intelligibility. Yeah. So I think language teaching has been predominantly about language, and not very much about communication. So it's been about, a lot of the time, the focus has been on static form rather than how we engage with each other in interaction. So I think we need to make teachers much more aware of the importance of intelligibility in communication, but also really we need to make teachers aware that they are providing options for students. So they're not mutually exclusive. It's not you focus on intelligibility or you focus on standard forms. You can focus on both. It's how much importance you attach to one and not the other. So I think, I don't think anybody's saying, oh, we need to focus on intelligibility but not worry about form. It's about how much relevance or how much salience we give to both. We don't, and if students want a particular form of English, then they should be taught that form of English. I think it's something that needs to be discussed together with the students. How important is British English to you or American English to you? Do you want to sound like a native speaker? If so, great, you can, or you can try. It's not as simple as that, obviously. But they're not mutually exclusive. You can promote both. If you want to focus on standard forms, you can, but at the same time, you can focus on communication strategies and how people interact with each other.
I think a lot of that comes from like the misconception that ELF is something that you can teach. So I'm going to teach ELF. So instead of, I'm not an EFL teacher anymore, and I'm an ELF teacher, but that's not really possible.
Yeah, so I think that's because we're still caught up in sort of thinking about language teaching in relation to the language itself, not in relation to what we do with language. So it's not, ELF is not another, and it's not about replacing one set of norms with a new set of norms. It's about moving beyond, which is why I use the term post-normative. It's moving beyond the concept of language as a set of norms, and thinking about language as a set of things we do, as a set of practices.
Absolutely. We have some more questions here. Domingo Savio says, I agree that teachers are becoming more aware of ELF and its pedagogical implications, especially in the expanding circle. What can we do to have teacher educators more engaged in the same process?
Have teacher educators more. This is problematic in the UK context. I don't know about elsewhere. I mean, in the UK context, we talk a lot in teacher education about different models of teacher education. So we talk about a craft-based model, applied science model, reflective model, and so on. But becoming a teacher, there's a really good understanding that becoming a teacher is about not just learning the techniques and the procedures, and not just learning about methodology. It's also about becoming a member of a sort of community of practice. So there's been quite a lot of focus on teacher identity. We've seen a move towards adopting a socio-cultural perspective on teacher learning, but how you become a teacher educator in the UK still predominantly follows a craft-based approach. In other words, you become a teacher educator by shadowing another teacher educator. And a lot of the time you get this perpetuation of the same old practices. And there isn't very much discussion among teacher educators of what has changed in recent years and how we need to develop responses to language. So I think it's a very challenging issue. So it's one thing to engage with teachers, but another thing entirely to engage with teacher educators, because essentially teacher educators are following a curriculum. And so this really now it becomes a question of being able to engage with policymakers, being able to engage with assessment boards, and the organisations that oversee the teaching awards. And yeah, this is difficult. Mm.
It is indeed. We have here Elton. He asked you, what's your view on ELF and standard integration of being the first step in the student's curriculum?
Can you repeat the question again? Sorry, is it?
What's your view on ELF and standard integration, ELF being the first step in the student's curriculum?
I'm not sure what's meant by standard integration. Do you mean integrating ELF with standard English?
I believe that's what he meant. Yeah.
So it's similar to what I was saying in response to the first question. I think the relationship, I know it's a complicated one. So the relationship between focusing on ELF and focusing on standard English. So I think it goes back to the idea that ELF is not about a set of forms. It's not. We're not looking to codify ELF. I think the starting point is presenting standard language forms from whatever variety or varieties are determined to be relevant by the teacher and students, and then moving away from those norms by looking at ELF as a perspective or an orientation. So I talk about ELF orientation or ELF perspective quite a lot, and I think that's important. So I think it's integrating. I think it's something that needs to be done side by side. So you present language forms, and then once you start presenting those forms, you talk about language or communicative strategies that people use in order to interact with each other. So I think, yeah, hopefully that answers the question. I'm not entirely sure it does.
No, yeah, he just confirmed that that's
okay,
what he meant. Right. So
great.
Good. Okay. We have here a question that was actually a comment in another one of the webinars, and the webinar was about course design and how ELF impacts course design, and I think it has to do with what we discussed here today. So I'm going to read it for you. So here, this person, who's a course book writer from a mainstream publishing house, Luis Otávio Barros, he said, I got the impression that ELF looks at a sentence such as, I live here for 10 years, for instance, as an acceptable piece of language. The student in question has no need to express herself accurately, and since it's probably a byproduct of L1 interference, which from an ELF perspective is no longer interference, which carries a negative connotation. So he says, in this case, and for these reasons, there seems to be little room for corrective feedback since message conveyance was successful and context appropriate. So where does that leave interlanguage restructuring?
Right. Where does that leave interlanguage restructuring?
Yeah,
I don't. I mean, my. That's a very big question. I don't know
it
because
is.
my focus has not been on. I mean, first of all, I think the concept of interlanguage becomes slightly problematic if you
Hmm.
adopt an ELF perspective, because adopting the term interlanguage suggests that you are midway between being a beginner in language and an endpoint, but there is
Hmm.
no endpoint. So I'm not comfortable with the term interlanguage
Hmm.
or interference. Obviously, I think
Uh-huh.
I think it would be more appropriate to talk about transfer because transfer can be negative and positive, and
Hmm.
a lot of the time transfer is positive. And that I think tends to be overlooked. The positive aspects of transfer can be overlooked, and I think transfer can come about in all sorts of very interesting ways. Yeah, I mean, we see in ELF data, we see continually how speakers might transfer from their L1 an idiomatic phrase, an idiomatic expression that doesn't translate directly into English, that doesn't have an equivalent in English, but is nonetheless being used, possibly first of all in L1 with code switching, and then translated. And I think what's interesting is when I talked about, I mean, some of the summary slides where I talked about what we know about ELF from the research is how much meta talk there is, how much conversation there is among speakers about the language forms that they use. And I think this is something that could be focused on more in language teaching. We could present students with more examples of how people talk about the way they're saying what they are saying. I've moved away, kind of moved away from the question a bit there. But,
No, makes perfect sense.
yes, yeah, yeah. The reformulate, yeah. I mean, taking out interlanguage, taking the word interlanguage out of that question, I think is a really important question. But we don't need to use the word interlanguage
Yeah.
in order to ask that question. But I'm not very well equipped to answer that question because I don't. I mean, that needs a good, really good SLA person to answer that question. I think. Yeah.
We have another question here from Mura. She asks, are your participants apparent disconnect between standard language beliefs and non-standard beliefs is not a conflict, but everyday awareness of relative prestige uses of language.
Mm. So it's not a conflict, but can you repeat the last part again?
It's not a
Sorry.
conflict, but everyday awareness
Uh,
of relative prestige uses of language.
oh, okay. Right. Yeah. 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 I don't think necessarily the teachers feel very conflicted. Um, I, I, but I see the conflict for me is where it being attached to a standard language ideology prevents teachers from doing something differently or prevents teachers from developing new practices. So, um, I mean, so again, a very interesting question and a really difficult one to answer because of the complexity involved in understanding how we think about language. I mean, the beliefs that we have about language are very deep rooted, and a lot of the time we're not conscious, we're not entirely aware of those beliefs. You know? I mean, in preparation for this, I listened yesterday to Robin Walker's webinar, and I thought it was very interesting how he talked about similar ideas. He talked about language attitudes in relation to accent, and he talked about his own prejudices surfaced when he talked about the conversation he overheard on a train traveling to Newcastle.
Mhm.
And I think that we all have deep rooted beliefs and attitudes about language. And yes, they can sometimes surface without us realizing. So there's not necessarily a conflict. And prestige is a really important concept here. I think promoting greater awareness of sociolinguistics for me is about getting teachers to understand that standard English is only standard English because it is the variety that we have decided that has prestige. There's nothing inherently prestigious about standard varieties. It's just that we've elevated those varieties to this special status. And I think the concept of prestige needs to be rediscovered, if you like. We can attach prestige to conventionally non-prestigious forms. So what we need to reassign prestige, I think. I don't know if that answers the question either, but
I think it does. And she has another question. She says, most of
right.
the language proficiency tests are
Yeah,
based on
of
standard
course,
English.
of course.
In
Yeah,
Sorry, it's not from her, it's from Mohammed.
right.
In that scenario, what do ELF learners have to do?
Well, what I think what needs to happen is we need to change the tests.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's the big problem that we are faced with at the moment. Well, there are two. One is how much importance is attached to language tests, how much status the tests have themselves. That's problematic, and then how uh, how these tests are not fit for purpose. They're not testing the right thing. So we need to change. First of all, we need to change our understanding of the role of testing. And then secondly, we need to change our understanding of language proficiency. And this is problematic, yeah, because the people that write the tests write tests that are really focused on reproducing standard forms. It's difficult to write a test that gives more salience to intelligibility than to accuracy or correctness. You know, tests for grammatical correctness are very easy to write.
Mm-hmm.
So
And very easy to assess.
then they're very easy to assess. Yeah. So the problem is the assessments need to change. Yeah. For the learner who is going to sit an exam, for the meantime, before we do manage to change testing in any radical way, then yeah, of course, students need to be taught the forms that they need to use in order to pass an exam. Well, that's yeah.
Yeah.
But as I said
And
before, they're not mutually exclusive. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
you can still teach for a test, and at the same time teach for language that you can use outside of a test situation. Most of the time, we're not using English in order to complete a test. You know?
Mm-hmm.
Once students have done their test, they're presumably going to go on and use English in very relevant, meaningful ways. So we can do both. We can teach students what they need in order to be successful in a language test, but also teach them or encourage them to use the language in communicatively effective ways that may be penalized in a test, but may be very successful in other contexts. Yeah.
Yes, I think as you said earlier, it's more about shifting our views and our attitudes than actually
Yeah.
shifting from a whole different paradigm that would
Yeah.
actually be similar, like a new set of norms. And just to wrap up, another one from Luis Otavio, as a course book writer, I think this is a very good question. He says, what would this work, how would this work in practice? For instance, what would an ELF oriented or maybe an ELF sensitive course book look like? He says fewer Eurocentric topics, more context sensibility, a wide range of accents. These are highly desirable features and not hard to implement. And then he goes on to the difficult part. But how does one go about designing the language syllabus and language practice activities if successful cross-cultural communication is the all and then all of teaching ELF? What is the role of accuracy and complexity? So again, we go back to accuracy because it is really embedded into designing courses and activities, I think.
Yeah, it is. It is. I think complexity is very important, more important than accuracy. So a lot of the time we talk about accuracy and fluency in language learning and language teaching, and we neglect complexity. So I think that's a really important point that's made in the question. However, we've tended to understand in the past complexity in relation to standard forms.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can again revisit the concept of complexity in the same way that I was suggesting we revisit the concept of prestige. You know, what we consider to be complex language might not be a standard language form. So we can look at complexity in terms of something that is sophisticated, but not necessarily accurate according to a set of standard forms. I don't have an answer for that question as such, because it is designing the language syllabus that is that pays closer attention to ELF. Yeah, is difficult and challenging. But I think maybe the wording of the question again suggests that ELF is about a different version of English.
A variety, right?
Yeah,
A
a
single
variety.
variety.
Yeah, it's difficult to get away from that. Yeah. Okay.
It is.
Sorry,
Martin, we have one more question,
okay, right.
if you still have the time for it. Let me see here. Elton says, promoting awareness and reassigning prestige being the goal, or which end would it be more effective, on the educators end, or the students? So who should we focus on first?
Right. I mean, the educators, we can't achieve anything unless we focus on educators, teacher educators. So I think it really, I mean, I would say that because I'm a teacher educator, and that's really, most of my work involves teacher education. I teach on a program for language teachers, and I've always been interested in teacher education, but I think really that is key. But we need to focus on teacher education, we need to focus on policymakers, we need to focus on publishers and materials writers, we need to engage with everybody involved, including students. And I think teacher education, we need to, if we have much more focus on sociolinguistics in language teacher education, then teachers will be much better equipped to discuss with their learners their reasons for learning English, their objectives in learning English, their goals in learning English, their relationship with the language, their understanding of the language socially as well as and politically, as well as linguistically. Yeah. Okay, I don't know. I hope I've answered those questions.
You did. You did.
It satisfies the people asking them, and I've hoped, that I've provided some interesting, thought-provoking ideas on what I've done in my research on ELF over the past couple of years. Thanks again for inviting me to take part. Apologies for the delay in starting this.
That's okay. Technology.
Technical problems. If I had started with Google Chrome as my browser to begin with, we would have started on time.
That's okay. It happens. Technology. So, Martin, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Again, for donating your time. And for those watching us now, if you're interested in getting your certificate, just go to bit.ly. I'm just going to paste the link here in the chat, bit.ly/BrELT ELF 2019 MD, which stands for Martin Dewey. Thank you so much. And at 7 p.m. Brazil time, we're going to have Priscilla Bordon talking about embracing and resisting ELF. So she's going to share everything that she learned there in Southampton with us.
Right. Great.
So
great.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, everyone. And have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.